This is Ultra Blue Energy coming at you. Today I want to talk about Kaijus, 300 feet tall monsters that burst everybody's eardrums when they roar, blast beam attacks out of their mouths, eyes, and chests, and always seem to put the city of Tokyo in danger. But this video is about an American giant monster, the super ape King Kong. Now I talk about this overgrown gorilla today because of his career. He barely has one. Sure, he fights dinosaurs, robots, and a dollar store Godzilla, but that was it. But what if we give him a much broader rogues gallery, just like the likes of Godzilla? Time to give King Kong some problems. Let's get this thing going. Now, as you guys know, King Kong holds the title of first giant monster. His debut in his first film in almost a century now has him standing firm in his place today in pop culture. The beast is still considered the #1 giant monster in many people's lists because of his big mark in history. Considering this fact, you would think Hollywood would invest more time into him than they did. You know, like giving him more stories that doesn't involve him fighting humans and monkeying around with women. Something like fighting other giant monsters. To be honest, Hollywood didn't try hard enough back then. After his big fight with Godzilla, they tried a few stories to attempt to play catch up with the Big G, but to no avail. His adventures in Skull Island just weren't enough. Sure, a select few of Kong's enemies are memorable, like his mechanized counterpart, which appeared 8 years before the other guy's mechanized counterpart, and a bunch of stupid ass dinosaurs, not to mention we don't get creatures like the Skullcrawler until 12 years after Kong's previous adaptation. Kong has a really minuscule rogues gallery for the first giant monster, but to fix that, I'ma do what Ultra Blue usually do and let my mind run wild. Before we get to all that, we gotta consider Kong's strengths and weaknesses. Kong is a beast that stands hundreds of feet in height with the proportional strength of a gorilla. He can lift tons of rock to throw and bash his opponent with, and use his grip to climb anything like the ape that he is. He can also use the strength in his legs to leap tall mountains in a single bound. He has the speed and stamina to match his strength, being enough for him to escape from tough situations if need be. His body is durable enough to take gunfire, napalm, and brute force from other monsters, but he is by no means a tank, so taking an abundance of damage isn't a great winning strategy. However, what would most likely assure his victory is his intelligence. He is able to use his environment to his advantage. He can pick up objects such as trees and carve them into weapons. Y'all seen how he uses that axe. Whether or not he gets to use it in all of his battles is uncertain, but he would still have to rely on his smarts either way. While he's stronger than most monsters, he is far from the strongest. He can't win them all, but the gorilla would definitely try. Not to mention, some humans will be willing to help out Kong because of his connection to humanity, and that right there is a wild card. Now I got his abilities out the way, onto the rogues. First, let's use monsters that already exist. That would be a great enemy for Kong if you consider it. The first monster I have in mind is the bird from the giant claw. Yeah, that colossal condor with the annoying screech. Yeah, I know, this thing is ugly. When you think about it, this guy really could have been a great King Kong enemy. He could even be a reoccurring villain turned ally. Speaking of monsters from the 50s, a few of these giant monsters could also be a Kong enemy. A giant scorpion, octopus, tarantula, and yes, even some of the dinosaurs too. There's also some monsters from the 60s that we could also use, like Reptilicus with his acidic abilities, the Chimera for the mystical side, and Wang Magui, which is a very freaky looking abomination to be honest. I was gonna include Dogara, but the Godzilla franchise already claimed him. He really should have been a Kong enemy too, because the dang lizard already has a blob monster that can fly. Speaking of Godzilla, let's look at the legendary monsterverse, cause several of these beasts could have been Kong enemies. Like, come on, Behemoth, Scylla, Methuselah, Kamazote. These guys should have been throwing hands with Kong for decades. Missed opportunities, man. Alright, let's pick them out. Kong will keep many of his original enemies. We'll use the giant claw so Kong can have a Rodan. Less of the screeching would be good too. A Kraken-like monster. I'll fuse the tarantula and the scorpion together and increase their height by hundreds. Reptilicus a chimera-like monster, Wang Magui, and from the Monsterverse we're borrowing Scylla, Methuselah, Kamazox, and Behemoth. That's it for all the borrowed monsters. It's time to be creative now.
Imagination.
Now, to create enemies for Kong, we have to understand his environment. Unlike his lizard counterpart, in which most of his villains are mutants or aliens, Kong will be more down to earth. His villains will be more natural. Let's start off with my first hypothetical enemy for Kong, a giant monster based off of a saber-toothed cat. I'ma give him the name Gawar. This idea came up when I was researching gorillas. I looked up what were the natural enemies of them. What came up first was a leopard. Gawar would be mostly mobile on all fours for speed advantage. The monster would only try to stand on two legs when fighting up close, though naturally his movement is hindered when he's standing on his hind legs. Theoretically, this creature would challenge Kong for his title on a periodic basis, but eventually become allies later. Another enemy idea could be Ogora, a blue grizzly bear based creature with massive claws capable of inflicting serious damage. This enemy would be in the neutral territory, because pretty much like most brown bears in real life, this beast isn't a threat unless you bother it, or invade its turf. Kong will get messed up by the claws in one fight with this unruly beast. As a result, the monkey would flee the first encounter, only to come back more prepared than before. Kong isn't gonna brute his way through every fight. This idea came up because people legit wonder if a silverback gorilla could take on a grizzly. Spoiler, it can't. Next is Megajaw, which is a beast resembling a crocodile, a monster that predictably is extremely fast in water. This monster would use ambush tactics if the creature is near water. Megajaw would plot against King Kong in this made-up movie scenario. The first encounter would have him attempt to take Kong's head off with a bite. Luckily, Kong evaded, but the croc-like monster would severely disadvantage Kong with a bite to his left arm, leaving Kong injured for the remainder of this hypothetical movie. This would allow the audience to take a gander of Kong's intelligence, because he would use different materials to tend to his injuries. Later, the two monsters would encounter each other again, but this time King Kong is prepared. He would blind Megajaw by stabbing him in his eyes, use a chain to clamp that jaw shut, and beat and batter him into submission. Kong wins with smarts again. Now let's give King Kong an arch-nemesis, like Godzilla to King Ghidorah. I introduced Drago, the ancient evil. Now unlike Kong vs. Godzilla back in 1962, Kong doesn't have his lightning powers. Pretty sure that was a one-time thing anyway. They instead will be granted to this new monster. Drago is a scaly demon-like monster resembling Pogasari, the horned monster from the North Korean monster movie back in 1985. In this hypothetical movie scenario, Drago would awaken from his million-year slumber thanks to humans messing around in an ancient temple. The dreaded King of Chaos will cause unfathomable destruction. Now in this scenario, I'm gonna pick living collateral damage, an unfortunate victim who got into the path of Drago, and it'll have to be the bear-like monster from earlier. A monster that gave King Kong a hard time with her massive claws proceeds to get swatted like a fly, and then King Kong will step in trying to take on this monster himself. However, King Kong is severely outmatched. Drago's energy manipulation powers and force fields is too much for any monster to handle. The humans would have to go back to the old temple that was ruined and attempt to find a weakness. In the final showdown, King Kong, two other monsters, and even the humans team up to slay Drago. Something to know about Drago is that he is in fact a vengeful beast, so he will come back for revenge. There's only a few monster ideas left, so let's go through them. Cornox, the Unbreakable, is Kong's Hedorah, but the exact opposite. For this monster is made entirely of the hardest material in the universe, the actual first alien monster that Kong would fight. Seeing Kong attempt to crack the monster's skin would be interesting. Up next is Clone Kong, which is a white mutated clone of King Kong that thinks he's the real King Kong. And I promise you, this is not a stab at Rampage. And finally, the last monster I have in mind, Zagos, which is King Kong's destroyer, an alien monster that invades worlds and consumes them. But it's not one alien monster, but a monster formed from thousands of worm-like organisms, only forming into one giant monster when fighting or traveling worlds. So there you have it, people. A bigger, better Kong rogues gallery. Most of them being prehistoric or ancient threats. Man, I love having an imagination. But what are your thoughts? What would you guys come up with? Go ahead, exercise your imagination. With that being said, you know what to do if you like what you see. This is UltraBlueENERGY, blasting off.